Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 of Greek for the Rest of Us. Today we are going to be continuing to look at Greek verbs, specifically looking at the non-indicative verbs. Last time we looked at the indicative Greek verbs. Now we're getting into second part of Greek verbs. So first off, we're going to look at aspect. And if you'll recall, in Greek, the tense kind of carries two loads. It communicates what aspect the verb is in, but it also communicates time. We saw that in the indicative verbs. But, as we see here, once out of the indicative, the Greek verbal system has no, and that is no absolute time significance. It's all about aspect. So we're going to talk a little bit about relative time, but there's no absolute time once you're out of the indicative. So going through the tenses then, the aorist tense stem indicates an undefined action. Again, as we're thinking about aspect. So it's undefined in its aspect. The present tense stem indicates a continuous action. The perfect tense stem indicates a completed action with ongoing effects. This is a significant difference from English. Just because a non-indicative verb is formed from the present tense doesn't mean it describes an event happening in the present. It only means it's continuous. So when you think about the stem of verbs, we need to keep in mind that you might see a verb in a non-indicative form, and it might have a present tense stem, but that does not necessarily mean it's present time or happening in the present. And then just a reminder that mood is the verb's relationship to reality. So as we get into the non-indicative moods, it's going to be key to realize that what's underneath that is the idea that mood is how a verb describes its relationship to reality. So did it really happen? Is it describing what might happen? Is it describing what ought to happen? The first thing we'll look here is see the subjunctive mood. Two different types of subjunctives. There are purpose subjunctives and conditional subjunctives. There's, again, a variety more than that, but these are going to be the two most common that you'll see. So the first is the purpose. Because the subjunctive mood is one step removed from reality, describing what might be or what could be, it's appropriate for purpose statements. So you're going to find a purpose statement, and it's typically going to be in the subjunctive mood. The same is true of conditional statements. The subjunctive can also be used in the if or the protasis of a conditional sentence, the if/then pairing. So we see an example of this purpose in John 17:1. Doxason su ton huion hina, and this is going to be your purpose clause, hina, purpose word. Hina ha huias doxase se. So glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. So this doxase is going to be in the subjunctive. The next non-indicative mood that we'll look at is the imperative mood. The imperative mood. One primary thing to note here is that the imperative mood is going to be for commands. The basic function of the imperative mood is to state a command. Another very important aspect to understand about the imperative mood is the idea of person. In English, all imperatives are second person. So if you hear something like go to bed, there's an implied subject, and the subject is always you or y'all, basically. It's going to be second person singular or second person plural. In Greek, the imperative is going to be either in the second or the third person. So there are third person imperatives third person imperatives in Greek. And second. So, different than English, there's going to be both third persons and second person imperatives. An example of a second person imperative is actually right up above where we saw John 17. We'll copy that down there. The doxasan, the first part of that, su, ton, huion, that is, you glorify your Son. The Son is praying to the Father with a imperative, glorify your Son. So again, there's the implied you there. Now we'll also look over and see a third person. So here's a third person imperative in John 14:27. Me tarasesto humon he cardia mede deliato. So there's actually two third person imperatives here. Do not let your heart be troubled, nor let it be fearful. In English, this translation, do not let your heart be troubled, we hear that, and that sounds second person. But it's not. Because these are actually third person endings, and this would be something that Logos would tell you, that this is actually third person and third person. So these are actually instructions for your heart to obey, and your heart to not be troubled and to not be fearful. So the main emphasis there is on the heart not being troubled and the heart not being fearful. Obviously, this plays out practically, and it's a second person implications because we have to actually do that. But the grammatical command is third person, and it's directed at the heart to not be troubled and to not be fearful. So that's going to be critical just as you get accustomed to recognizing imperatives, is to realize there is the category for third person imperatives in Greek. All right, again, not technically a mood, but we come now to the infinitive. With the infinitive, there's going to be two types of infinitives we'll look at, the complementary and the purpose infinitive. The infinitive can complete the thought of a verb. It completes the thought or complements the thought of a verb. So the example here in John 16:19, egno ha Iesus hati elthelon auton eroton. This eroton is in the infinitive, and it's connected directly to the they were wishing here, the ethelon. So they were wishing to question. It's the complement to that verbal idea, so it kind of completes the thought of the verb. Jesus knew that they were wishing. Wishing what? Wishing where? Wishing why? Wishing to question him. And then the infinitive can also be for purpose. The infinitive can indicate purpose. John 1:33. Ha pempsas me baptizein en hudati ekenos moi apen. So, the one who sent me to baptize in water or with water said to me. So this idea of a purpose, the purpose of he was sent to baptize. Now, this is a little bit different than the complementary because this kind of stands alone a little bit better, whereas the to baptize is really highlighting the purpose element of why. Why was this person sent? This, the previous example is not so much asking the question of why. It's not they were wishing. Why were they wishing? They were wishing to question. It's more the complement. But with the purpose, it's answering the question of why. Coming on to participles. As in English, a Greek participle is a verbal adjective. So in 9.11, Mounts talks about the adverbial participle. And the adverbial participles emphasize the verbal nature of the participle, and they modify a verb. And then usually it's the main verb of the clause. So it's going to be really emphasizing the verbal nature, and it's going to be modifying a verb. Two different types, or two different things to see when we're talking about that. First, they're going to be anarthrous. They're not going to have the article. So adverbial particles will always be anarthrous. And if you remember, that means anarthrous just means no article. So you're not going to see ha or hey, because these articles are cluing you in that something is having a nounal / adjectival function. So the adverbial participles will be anarthrous, and then when it comes to temporal participles, one of the most common uses for the adverbial participles is to indicate relative time. So when was this thing happening relative to the main verb? So this is called relative time. In other words, the time of the participle is relative to the time of the main verb. So the aorist participle indicates an action prior to the time of the verb. So if you think about it, aorist is generally thinking of the previous time. So when you're thinking about relative time, relative to the main verb, it's going to be before. And then if you think the present participle indicates an action occurring at the same time as the verb. So you translate that when or while. And then we get on to the idea of attributive participles. So attributive participles are, we're now no longer talking about no longer talking about adverbial. These are adjectival participles. So an adjectival participle can modify a noun or a pronoun. Again, that's what an adjective does. An adjectival participle can do what an adjective does because it is an adjective. It's just a reminder of basic grammar that an adjective modifies nouns. And we call these attributive participles because they are attributing something to, giving an attribute of something. So these are generally going to be articular. There's usually going to be an article. And then there's going to be case, gender, and number agreement. So if you have a genitive noun, a noun that's in the genitive, you're going to have an attributive participle also be in the genitive that's modifying it. And then the third type of participle is the substantival participle. This is when the participle itself is functioning as a noun. So this is going to be generally articular. So there's usually going to be either ha or hey or some inflection of that. The key difference in distinguishing attributive from substantival is going to be that the latter will not have a word to modify it, or to modify. So it'll be kind of a standalone word, and you won't see something in context that it could be modifying. And just a chart to kind of think through this when you're thinking about participles. If it's anarthrous, if it doesn't have a noun, it's probably adverbial. If it's articular, it's probably adjectival. And if it's adjectival, there's one of two categories it could fall into. Either it's attributing something, it's an adjective, or it's substantival and it actually is functioning as a noun in the sentence. Looking at our vocabulary for this chapter, we have oida. Oida is I know or I understand. Gnosko, I know or I understand. Pistuo, I believe or I trust. Thelo, I want. Didomi, I give. Dunamai, I am able. Estheo, I eat. Echo, I have. Lambano, I take or I receive. And poieo, I do or I make.